our first speaker today this afternoon will be GORDON CALLEJA, who is assistant professor at ITU Copenhagen and also a director of the Institute of Digital Games at the University of Malte, Center for Game Research. And he will present us today, he will make a presentation, the topic of which is games and the reconceptualization of narrative. Okay, thank you, Gordon, for accepting this.
Hi everyone. First of all, thanks for the invitation and thanks for giving me up. It's really an honor to be here. I have a fair bit of material to cover, so I'll try and get through it religiously. If I collapse halfway through the talk, it's because of your fantastic food, fantastic wine, and then so much of it going down my gullet. I'm kind of tottering on a food coma here. Okay, so yeah, as introduction went, I run the Institute of Digital Games, where I'm also associate professor. I'm also associate at ITU Copenhagen, where I ran the Center for Games Research for 5 years, and I have a game studio called Mighty Box, where I make games at. I'm a game designer there. So yeah, I'm a very gamey person. This is going to be a very gamey talk. Very quickly, I'm just going to mention some of the stuff that I've worked on and working on. The last game that's worth mentioning I've made is called Love Tear Us Apart. It's an adaptation of Joy Division's song, Love Will Tear Us Apart, and it has to do with the difficulty of translating metaphor into simulation, two things which often don't work well together, and also about relationships going bad and that kind of and bad love, and that kind of very abstract subject I wanted to try and simulate. It was called the most depressing video game ever made by Spin Magazine, which is an honor when you're covering Joy Division. Success. Next thing I'm working on is a story world called Post-Human. It looks at all the transhumanist and post-human theory and tries to turn that into a projection starting from sort of now into a future where we created genetic successors of ours who feel that they are sort of the evolved version of us, and the only way for them to exist and for the world to exist is to eradicate us because we're a virus. And that's taking the shape of a board game, which is almost done. That's a prototype right there. And then another game which is it's based on emergent narrative concepts in game studies, and it's a hybrid of Euro game mechanics, or Euro board game mechanics, and graphic novel. So it's very narrative heavy, and it's the kind of thing that I'm also pursuing in my research track, and this is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And I'm going to give us a sort of brief overview of where things stand in narrative in games, both on the industry side and both in academia. And I'm going to make a provocative kind of argument, which is to say that things are very stuck in the development of narrative, both in academia and industry. And the reason for that is that we don't have a solid enough concept for what game narrative is. It's one of the most discussed concepts in both industry and academia, yet I feel that we're going off in circles. And I think that the reason I'm going to put my cards on the table and say that our conceptualization of narrative is just flawed, because our conceptualization, I didn't do that, that didn't change. Our conceptualization of narrative is based on older, non-interactive, non-erotic media. It's based mostly on a legacy coming from film and literature. Now, games are a fantastically varied family of objects, the distant members of whom have very little to do with each other. Right? If we think of paintball and Tetris, sorry, if we think of Counter-Strike and Tetris, might as well be talking about paintball and knitting or gardening. We think of World of Warcraft and turn-based strategy games. You could be talking of a social club or a band club and a spreadsheet, right? They're activities that have some similarities between them, but they're not a coherent whole. So different types of games have got different genealogies. They come from different media. Some come from puzzles, some come from board games, some come from film and literature. So it makes sense that we've taken on film and literature notions of narrative, but we kind of got stuck there, I believe. And we need to reconceptualize narrative. Games demand us to reconceptualize the notion of narrative if we are going to include games as something that narrative theory can help us understand better, to create more interesting game narratives. If we look at the industry, there's a whole, in the Game Developer Conference, which is the main event for game developers from around the world to meet at and discuss, there's a whole summit dedicated to narrative. It's that important. And I'm going to pick a couple of examples here. David Cage does games which are very narrative oriented. He even avoids calling them games and calls them interactive narratives instead. And these games are very narrative heavy. Now I just want to pick a little quote here, which is, I like storytelling since I was a kid. I always liked stories. I thought this is a very universal thing. You can tell a story that means something to a Japanese guy, an American guy, a woman, or a German. And the crucial thing there is tell. I think a lot of people talk about narrative in the industry, they talk about the narrative, an old notion of narrative, which is the narrative we tell. I have a story, I'm going to tell you that story. And you might have an option or two, you have a structure which is a main branch that might sort of branch off and have maybe different endings, but as such, you activate, in David Cage and a lot of narrative heavy games, you activate existing narratives that the designer or writer intended. So you're interacting, but only structurally to activate what has been pre-scripted. And I think that this is really not the most interesting thing that games or simulations bring to the table when we talk about narrative. I think that's more of a, I like film, I want to be a filmmaker, I want to be a writer, and I'm going to use games to make that interactive. But it's sort of departing from one end. Another talk by veteran game design and narrative writers, Tom Abernathy and Richard Roos, is this hour-long passionate speech to argue, make a solid argument that the three-act structure doesn't actually always apply to games. And it's stunning that this is a 2014 talk at GDC, when it's kind of obvious to me that, of course, a three-act structure doesn't apply to games, because the three-act structure was not intended for a medium that involves one or many participants and their interacting minds. And basically their argument is they use Fallout 3 as an example, and these white dashes here, these white lines are different sort of bits of narrative that you can engage with, and they're all jumbled up. There's no 3-act structure, and that's the conclusion. Guys, you know what? We've discovered there's no 3-act structure. Of course there isn't, because you can have any kind of structure in a simulation, right? Any kind of structure. If you build a world and there's story elements to it, I mean, it's going to be very contrived if you force your players to go through a particular sequence. So, the problem here again is that they're talking, there's an implication of what they mean by narrative, which is an old-fashioned and outmoded idea of narrative. That idea that these little white lines that they're talking about when discussing structure are what they intended as creators for you to consume. But there's a lot more to game narrative than that, and that's what I'm going to be describing later on. What is the a lot more, and what is for me the more interesting part of game narrative? If we switch to academia, we have a number of game studies methodologists, theorists that made a strong case against narrative, or as such they view narrative as that thing which narratology, classical narratology, has outlined. Everything that is outside of that mold is not narrative, it's something else, it's game. And we have something like Marco Escalinen, who writes, it should be self-evident that we can't apply print narratology, hypertext theory, film or theatre, and drama studies directly to computer games. And in the same paper, the minimal definition of narrative derived from Gerald Prince and Gerard Genet states basically there must be two things or components that constitute a narrative: a temporal sequence of events and a narrative situation, both narrators and narratives for starters. I think we can safely say we can't find narrative situations within games. And that's a really weird clash of ideas, and it's on the same paper, simply because, if we take Genet for example, the first thing that he states in narrative discourse is this is a model, a framework created specifically for literature, not theatre even, or film. This is a model for literature, and that's why it's useful, at least from a structuralist perspective, because it's quite detailed and it can focus on the specific properties of the medium. And the specific properties of the medium are essential for us to create theories or models around the thing. So no, Genet doesn't apply to games. Ideas or concepts from Genet can apply to games, but a theory overall doesn't apply because it is not intended specifically for it, and there's going to be variation once you get into the detail. You might, sort of at a cursory glance or at a certain higher level of granularity, apply the thing. But if you look closely, then I'm going to argue it does not apply, and Genet is excused because he declares this. Jesper Juhl hits upon another crucial point. He states you cannot have interactivity and narration at the same time, one of the most often quoted phrases in game studies. And this means in practice that games almost never perform basic narrative operations like flashback and flash forward. It's not the case, but anyway, games are almost always chronological. What he really means here is that you cannot have interactivity and narration at the same time, because narration happens in the past. It's something that has been encoded. If you look at Chapman's model here, we have story of the content of narrative, and that is organized or structured and then conveyed in some form or other to a reader or viewer, and that's done, and thus it is something that has happened in the past. I am reorganizing an existing objective sort of ideal story, which is again another point of contention whether this even exists outside of its expression, but that's a whole other conversation. And so it is something that happens in the past. I'm reorganizing a past event, while interactivity happens in the moment of doing, right? And so Juhl claims that there cannot be narrative and interactivity at the same time, because those structures are not compatible. Now, if we look at this model, I'm going to again argue that it doesn't fit games, or it doesn't fit all of the narrative in games. It does fit possibly that part of narrative that these designers like David Cage or Abernethy and Roos were talking about, the thing that they have encoded or put inside the game for you to consume. We can still think about that narrative possibly in this way, but there's a whole other thing. And what that misses out, or that sort of model that comes from that binary idea from linguistics and semiotics and so on, is that there is a player involved here. It isn't simply that which has been encoded by an all-knowing creator, but there is also the generation of a narrative. And the most crucial element of a game is the feedback loop between mechanical system, representational system, and the player, right, the human mind. And it isn't simply a consumer, the player is not simply a consumer of a text, right? It doesn't simply interpret the text, but reconfigures the text and configures the text. The player changes the actual nature of the object in order for the object to exist. Again, happens when we interact with it, when we create that moment as a sort of event in the history of that system. So, without it, there isn't a text. There is a potential for a text. Now, if we take an example like Faster Than Light, a clever indie game, where this is a very simple concept. You have your ship here, orchestral. You have your crew members, which you give them specific names, which are important because the characters are very vague here. They don't have a strong representation. You can, I usually call them my names of my girlfriend, my friends, whatever. So when they burn and die, I have some sort of image of who's burning and dying. I have more attachment to it. I think it's a very simple and clever move. You have your ship, and stuff is happening with the ship. And the goal is to get away from these exclamation marks, which are the Imperial fleet trying to get you. And you have to move this direction to the exit. Every time you move from one point to another, an event is unlocked, something happens. Usually you get attacked by a ship. But sometimes there's a little bit of story, and you have to make a little choice, and so on. So it's pretty straightforward. You jump. Every time you jump, you lose a fuel, and then stuff happens. The idea is to go through 8 of these screens, and then fight the mothership or whatever. Really simple. But what's happening here is, what is the story? Is the story narrative, there is Imperial fleet, which may be evil or maybe not, or you're evil, I don't know, and you're trying to get away from it. There's not much of a story there, but it does generate really rich stories. But how does that happen? Where is the manifestation? Where is the discourse here? Is it pre-written, or is it happening in the moment of my engagement? When the events in this system are me moving, me making a decision, me telling Marvin, my programming buddy, to go from one room to the other and put out a fire. That is an event. There is a character in a world, and there's an event, there's a movement from one place to another. Yet, that expression, that manifestation of the story that exists, is happening at the moment. It's not prescriptive. So, we have the basic elements of narrative. We have a world, agents, objects, and events. But we also need to think of rules, add rules and code to those basic elements that create narrative. Looking at another example from participants in a larger study that I did as a preparation for my main work, which is on involvement and immersion. I have this one of many snippets of participants describing what story means to them. And it was never the story of the game itself, but it was their own sort of export in the world. I once went from Darkshore, took the better part of an afternoon, and did it just because I wanted to, and it was one of those few times that I didn't mind something taking so long. Was it fun? Yes. But didn't you mind? It wasn't something that everyone has done. It was an adventure. I didn't know if I could or not. A nice challenge, and not something that the game mechanics guided me through. It was my story. And again, we have all the elements of narrative here, but what is discourse here? What is the pre-structuring? There isn't a pre-structuring. There are elements which were given to recombine and create story. And maybe we just need to think about different legacies of story generation, story making. A different legacy that's kind of obvious for games, but we seem to miss out on its narrative dimensions, is play, right? As I said before, there are different games have different genealogies, and often we have a mixture of the literary, the dramatic, and the filmic mixed in with play and with games. So how does that feature narrative? Now, if we look at Roger Callois' model of play, he really briefly has these two ends of a continuum, which go from play to game. Idea, which is free-form movement, free-form play. It's me kicking a ball around the beach, just kicking it around. And then on the further end we have activities which are completely rule-based. Activities which, without the rule system, they mean nothing. If I give you a chess set, and I've never played chess and I don't tell you the rules, you can throw it at your friend, you can bite it, you can use it as a cup holder, but it's difficult, you cannot really engage with the system unless you know it. It does not lend itself to be discovered as an object of play. And then, if we go back to the beach, if I put a stick down and I decide I'm going to kick my ball into the stick, I have added a rule, I am moving towards the ludus continuum. And the more rules I add to that free-form play, I move from paideia to ludus. So that's kind of how this model works. It's simplistic, but it does its job. You can call this the game end, rule-based game end. This is free-form play end. And these are further subdivided into agon, competition, alia, luck, mimicry, acting, some sort of role, and alinx movement. And what we could also add here is story. We play, as kids and otherwise, to generate stories, right? If we have a dollhouse, and we have a miniature world, and the miniaturization there is important, I believe, for the generation of narrative. We have characters, we have a world, and there are events that we enact. Not given those events, we enact those events. It's just a simple, different format. We look at a more rule-based narrative form. You can look at tabletop role-playing games, where you have a world, you have a rule system, a mode of representation. These all combine with verbal utterances and the mind of the dungeon master to create an ongoing story, right? But again, the story is not told, it's generated. We're moving away from retelling something in the past to generating something in the moment. And all these have an emphasis on the imagination, right? What we're looking at here is different ways of structuring the imagination. It's kind of obvious. And it isn't just games or play that do this. Maybe games and play require it, because they require interaction, require an active mind in order to enact something, right? But all forms of narrative media, we can look at them as ways
to structure the formation of story in the imagination. Right? The techniques of literary structure and the signs, the marks on the book and the book itself all contribute to forming images in our mind. They're not perfectly determined by the author, of course, but they're still shaped. And same thing with film, drama, games. That's the underlying denominator, I think, that we need to look at to start the rediscovery of narrative. 5 minutes. About halfway through. Okay, no worries. But there are lots of challenges to this approach. Mainly, what makes a segment of experience while engaging in a game a narrative one and not something else? Is any general thought related to a game, or while playing a game, part of narrative experience? No. If we make it that broad, then the utility of the narrative part of that experience becomes lost. And which actions in a game constitute narrative elements and which don't? If I move from left to right in a corridor and then left to right again, is that a narrative operation? No one's going to want to read that action in the book. But within games, are these very trivial actions also narrative elements? How do we separate? Tough one. And we don't want to go too far with this, or the tricky part that some theorists have tried to get into experiential narrative have, I believe, failed because then they go a bit too broad. And following like Bruner's work, Actual Minds, Possible Worlds, and this narrative turn that happened in the late 60s and 70s, where we saw the narrativization of the self, of social groups and so on, where narrative was employed as a metaphor to understand human experience and human social experience in general, then that makes it a little bit too broad, because then we're not looking at the specificities of the medium. If I want to make an interesting game with an interesting narrative, it doesn't help to tell me everything is a narrative. Any engagement with anything is going to be a narrative, and then where are my guidelines? How can I understand that this is effective or not? How do I create a certain sense of drama, of finesse of narrative expression? I think Mary Laurie Ryan is a great, has a great contribution here. She's done great work in trying to find a narrative theory that bridges various media, and she shifts from narrative as seen as a property of a text encoded in the text, like the classical narratologists had done, and moves away to narrative as a construct, as a mental construct that is activated by elements in the text. And she again focuses on an image, a mental image that's activated by these signs, and this image constitutes a world or a setting populated by agents or characters, and these agents contribute to events which creates a plot. What we can add to this with games are rules and code. Rules also, contrary to you, rules generate story as well, right? We don't have to explain that the ship is going to blow up. If the ship is flashing red and there's no more health in it, then that ship is going to blow up. You don't have to represent it. Rule animates images in the mind, if you know the system, of course. So, I'm running out of time, so I was going to give you a kind of hot solution, but I'm going to have to leave you hanging. They're stopping me. Anyway, I just wanted to make this kind of case for rethinking a bit narrative and sort of, making a sort of concerted effort to change it. And really quickly, it starts off with a separation within games of scripted narrative, that old idea of narrative as something as the trait we want to tell stories when we make. The games I make have got I want me to be in there because I'm narcissistic as a creator. I think all creators are in some ways narcissistic, and we want ourselves in there, we want people to experience what we have in our minds and share that. So there's that element, and then there's something I call autobiography. A biography in an alternate space. And that could be called emergent narrative, could be called experiential narrative, all of them have their flaws. But it's basically what happens when I interact in a world and I generate a narrative through interaction with elements in the world. You can look at the structures of scripted narrative, progression. There are various structures that we can map out, and there are various ways of delivering those structures to cutscenes, narration, story chunks. This list will keep going on as we invent new ways of communicating the images in our mind that we structure a story to others. But the constituent elements of a game, being a player, the sign systems, audio, visual, and so on, mechanical systems, the rules and the code and so on, and the medium that we interact with, the hardware, create a matrix that is the game, and that's exactly what this autobiography is. It's a player's perspective on, this is our experiential perspective, this is the game as object, the artifact, and it's a matrix of relations. So all narratives happen somewhere there. Some are more developed by science, some are more developed by rules, or something in between. And obviously if you have different players, you're going to have different takes on that. You don't determine for the player the exact story that you want to give. You give more of a story world and an affordances for narrative. So we need to sit back as creators and give our players crayons, paints to create their own narrative. And there's a lot of work that can be done to give more interesting paints, right? More interesting canvases for people to create story. But it's a matter of giving control away. There's so many slides there, but I'm going to stop. Just tease you.
Thank you very much. We might